This chapter is on unemployment, the unemployment rate in the case of the missing workers. So let's go over what I have here on the notes, and then I want to focus on a few things that are in the chapter. All right, so the definition of unemployed is really not a very good one when you think about it. This is how the federal government defines if you're unemployed. They do these phones, they do a survey, they call up whoever they're using for their survey, the number of people in their data set, and they ask, do you have a job? Yes or no. Then the second question is, are you actively seeking work? Yes or no. So if you don't have a job, but you've stopped looking for a job, you're not considered to be unemployed. So that's one reason why the unemployment rate is very flawed, because the unemployment rate is people who are unemployed but actively seeking work divided by the total labor force. So the unemployment rate is really understated. Some economists think the unemployment rate should really be about 3 percentage points more than the stated rate. All right, so let's take a look at this. The definition of unemployed, as I just said, is somebody who does not have a job and is actively seeking work. If an individual is no longer looking for work, they're not included in the unemployment rate. They've kind of fallen off the radar, and they're considered a discouraged worker. So the number of discouraged workers has, it has risen. So the unemployment rate is really lower than reality. All right, so here's the formula for the unemployment rate. It's the unemployed, meaning you don't have a job, but you're actively seeking work, divided by the total labor force. The total labor force is defined as the non-institutionalized population. So between the ages of, I think it's 18, it's either 16 or 18 and 65. And if you are not in prison or in a hospital, mental hospital or regular hospital. So basically any adult that's able to work and is not institutionalized, that's the total labor force. So, and the way so we have the unemployment rate, which I just explained, but this next statistic is increasingly becoming a more important statistic. The labor force participation rate. Okay, that's the employed plus the unemployed divided by the total labor force. What is particularly problematic is that the labor force participation rate is decreasing and has decreased significantly. So, and I'll talk about that later in a few minutes, but I just mentioned that the unemployment rate is understated because of discouraged workers. And overall, it's understated, but can you think of why the unemployment rate might be overstated? Well, you have a lot of people who are out there working for cash. So there's people who might be considered unemployed. They say they're actively seeking work, but they're collecting an unemployment check, but they're out there actually working for cash. So you have people working under the table. So that would make the unemployment rate seem higher than it is. But overall, the net effect is you have a lot more people who have fallen off the radar. So the unemployment rate is really understated. All right. So in addition to the unemployed, you have what's called underemployed. Underemployed means that many people are working in jobs where they're not utilizing their skill set. So during the Great Recession, we had a lot of people, when we had the whole financial crisis, we had a lot of people who were working in the finance industry, and analysts, traders, what have you, who lost their jobs and never got those jobs back. So let's say you have a financial analyst who was laid off from a job making $120,000 a year or so or more, and is now working in retail, making 60 or 70,000. So that's what we mean. That's what we mean by underemployed. Okay, so let me, before I get to the main takeaways, let me talk about some things in chapter 12. So they mentioned how during the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was 25%. But actually, that's not true. They say the unemployment rate was 25%, or 1 in 4 Americans were out of work, but they weren't including people who were working for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, or the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So during the Great Depression, the government had all these programs to get people back to work. So the WPA workers built the Hoover Dam, for example. They built the UEP Long Bridge was a WPA project. Probably some buildings at LSU were WPA projects. So there were these massive infrastructure. The WPA, but in addition to a lot of other jobs, had a lot of infrastructure jobs. So the government got a lot of people back to work through these government programs, but they weren't counted as being employed. So if you account for all those people, they theorize that the unemployment rate during the Great Depression was really only 17%, not 25%. So that's mentioned in the book. Okay, and they talk about discouraged workers and also the labor force participation rate. So if you go to page 83, and this would be interesting to look up on your own. You can look up online and just look and see what the labor force participation rate was before COVID and after COVID, or what the current participation rate is. It's probably down in the low 60s still. But anyway, in the book, they say that from 2007 to 2009, the labor force participation rate went from 66% to 63%. So think of that. Only 2/3 of people who are eligible to work are working, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. So what's going on with all this? Well, a lot of baby boomers are retiring. You know, some people have enough money. They feel that they can live on their retirement, what have you. They're retiring early. Some people are they were laid off and just never went back to work, and they've made it work financially. They're staying home with kids or what have you. Some people are living in their parents' basements playing video games and not working. So there's any number of things. A lot of people are on disability, and this is really interesting. Social Security disability used to be really hard to get, but it's much easier to get Social Security disability. Now, you or I probably wouldn't be happy on Social Security disability making, I think it's like $1,200 a month. But there's some people who are perfectly happy to be on Social Security disability, making $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 a month, whatever it is, and living that way. So the point that they make in this chapter, and in other chapters too, talking about the Social Security disability, that there's a direct correlation between this increase in people on disability through Social Security and a decrease in the labor force participation rate. So they made it easier to get Social Security disability, and also there are ailments that are harder to prove now. So if you go to it, and there's also like a whole subculture where these doctors are kind of in bed with the patients, trying to enable people to get on Social Security disability. So these doctors will, if you go to the doctor and you say you have PTSD or an anxiety disorder or back pain, those kinds of things are really hard to prove or disprove. And so people are saying those kinds of things. And again, people are behaving based on incentives, and some people are incentivized to try to get this disability. So anyway, that's disability through Social Security is actually one of the reasons why we have this decrease in the labor force participation rate. All right. Also, this is really interesting. A current issue is this, again, it's March of 2022, and we're just coming out of COVID. And so there's this huge labor shortage. And so the popular press initially was saying, well, why is there this huge labor shortage? Well, First of all, because people were getting unemployment, really high unemployment rates, payments through stimulus, because the government didn't adjust the unemployment. They were giving people an extra $600 every 2 weeks on unemployment. Normally, the unemployment checks they're adjusted for the cost of living in a particular state. They didn't feel like they had time to do that when COVID first hit. So they just said, everyone's getting an extra 600 if you're on unemployment. Well, for people in states with a lower cost of living, like Mississippi, like Louisiana, people were making more in unemployment than they were working. So that's one reason why the labor force participation rate decreased. We had the shortage of workers. Also, people had stimulus money, so they were not incentivized to work. And then people started blaming the millennials and saying that, oh, the millennials just don't want to work. That's the problem. That's why, we can't, it's so hard to find things. And just one of the big problems with COVID was, restaurants can't open because no one wants to work, and they're blaming it on the millennials. Well, when the statistics actually came out, they found that it wasn't the millennials' fault. It was the baby boomers' fault, because they found that more people were leaving on the top end of the age spectrum than on the bottom end. And so they're calling it the Great Retirement. So a lot of people, when COVID hit, people in their 50s and 60s just said, you know what, I'm not going to deal with COVID, with all the problems of COVID, the working from home, or having to go back to work. They just retired. And so they're calling this situation the Great Retirement. So we have seen the labor force participation rate dip even more as a result of the Great Retirement. Okay, so anyway, the main takeaways from this chapter are: make sure you know the definition of unemployment and the definition and the formulas for unemployment and the labor force participation rate. How do they define who's unemployed? And why is the labor force participation rate so low compared to what it used to be decades before? And then on the exam, you might have some real simple computations where you calculate the unemployment rate or the labor force participation rate. All right, that's it for chapter 12. Take care.